probably on this call, despite the fact that Liz is, the opposite of a self-promoter. We really had this circled on their calendar because we love to hear about her experiences, right? So many people are talking about the God-shaped hole today, but I don't know anybody who's kind of gone about reckoning and even kind of working to fill the God-shaped hole with quite the kind of combination of tenacity and a methodical yet inquisitive and open-minded and pure-hearted nature like Liz. So I first came across Liz when I got into this issue of like, what do we do about the failings of secular society, and started organizing a gathering called Returning to Mystery. And then people told me about this issue of Dark Mountain, and my favorite essay in it was something called The God-Shaped Hole. Author Liz Slade. I had no idea who she was. And then I went to the first gathering of the Emerge Network, this kind of meta-modern avant-garde group, which would be like in the space of Thomas Bjorkman and Daniel Schmachtenberger and all of this stuff. And there was this Unitarian woman that was there that I was like, oh, that would be interesting to speak to her. And she left before, and I got her name. It's like Liz Slade. That rings a bell. What? I kind of looked her up afterwards and realized, like, oh my, that's exactly the person who wrote this essay. So I ended up in her office in London, and I don't know how long that conversation went on for, but I knew when I left that I had a friend for a long time, and that there was kind of a friendship of an ongoing dialogue that was going to continue. And so I'm very excited. I've never left any conversation with Liz, and there's been a lot by now, without a new pearl. So I'm really excited to put her in front of people. Her depth and seriousness and groundedness has always been an experience of both being part of having the courage to be part of creating a spiritual community at the outset in Sunday assembly, but then also like, let's actually, people talk all the time, what if we take a mature effort and do something with that? So she then kind of ends up in the Unitarians. I met her shortly after she rose to high office in the Unitarian Church, and to take that on has always been a bit like awesome to me, even intimidating. Like, wow, that's really something else to actually attempt uh, to take an institution like that was very early on in this kind of this conflict of, well, what do we do about creating a space for the sacred in a secular society, and work to make it current, coming from a very personal place of struggle. And so I think I'll leave it there because the rest is really for Liz to talk about. But it's, I think, quite a journey, and I'm sure we're interested to hear more. So with that, let's I give you Liz Slade. Liz.
Thank you, Liam. That was a lovely introduction. Yeah, so it was really nice to get this sort of invitation from Liam, really to kind of reflect on what I've been up to. And like he said, the essay that I wrote in 2017 for Dark Mountain was kind of the jumping off point for this. And it was really nice that the Dark Mountain on their Substack, they just republished that essay, which I know some of you will have seen. And so it's been really interesting to kind of revisit myself in 2017, which in some ways I think, oh, it's only just gone, but like so much has changed. Not in the wider world, but also kind of in myself, I think, as well. Um, and and that change in myself has been part and parcel of the work that I've been doing. I think, as is the case for all of us, we're changed by the work, the things that we attend to. Um, and and yeah, when I wrote that essay, which was for a sort of special issue of Dark Mountain on the sacred, which um, which apparently miffed a lot of people because they were sort of like, why are you talking about religion? Like religion's the enemy. Like, why would we care about that stuff? We're trying to move beyond that. Um, And but I'd been going to this funny Unitarian church for a few years at that point, and so had been on a particular journey with my relationship with religion through that. I only went through the doors of that Unitarian church for the first time because I'd seen that the minister was an atheist and he used to be a scientist. And so I felt pretty confident that he and I saw the world in the same way. Um, and it felt like, well, that's obviously not what I grew up thinking church was, and left behind without too much bother as a as a young person. Um, but certainly when I started, um, going in earnest to that Unitarian church, I really struggled with a lot of the language, and I also didn't tell anyone that I was going for about 2 years. Because I was just so embarrassed. Like it felt like a deeply embarrassing thing to be going to church. I kind of thought, well, how on earth can I explain this to my friends? Like they'll, it just won't make any sense to them. Um, so, and then of course, when I did get round to owning up to it, then I explained what it was like. Then people were like, "Oh, well, that sounds great. Like, what, can I come? Can I go to one too?" Um, it feels like it might be useful to just sort of explain what Unitarianism is, because most people in the world don't know.
Please. Yeah, I don't think people really know the roots of it. They kind of know a bit, but if it would be really great if you could kind of go through that and also maybe bring the rhymes with today and the Unitarian history out for us. I know that's always kind of mind expanding when we've done it before.
Yeah. So I always think that 1662 is a good starting point for the Unitarian story. So that was the point at which the sort of fairly new Protestant Church of England said, we've got a rule book and everyone's going to follow it. And if you don't, then you're definitely going to lose your livelihood and you might go to prison. And so the sort of proto-Unitarians and sort of proto-Quakers and all of the other sort of um, dissenters, as they were named, who were like, well, actually, it's against my conscience to adopt this codified rule book. I'm tending my flock as my conscience dictates, as my relationship with God dictates. I'm not going to follow your rule book. And so, yeah, and so in 1662, all of those who didn't sign up to that were then officially breaking the law. Um, and so those who didn't conform were then persecuted. Um, and well, there's enormous parallels with what's happening now in Britain and beyond, with those who dissent from the mainstream ideas of what normal behaviour should look like. We can maybe talk about that a bit more later. So yeah, so and then another sort of milestone for Unitarians after 1662 was 1774, which is when the first explicitly Unitarian congregation started meeting in what is now my office. And it at that point it was still illegal to be a Unitarian. And what they meant by Unitarian at that point is sort of unity as opposed to the Trinity. So thinking of God as one rather than as three. And part of thinking of God as one is includes that Jesus isn't God. Jesus is just a man, and definitely a venerated teacher. And for Unitarians back then, definitely the teacher, but definitely human. And so, yeah, so that was enough to get you put in prison back in 1774, but they continued. And the people who were part of those early Unitarian congregations were phenomenal people, so Joseph Priestley, was kind of the closest that we have to a founder, I think, in British Unitarianism. But people like Benjamin Franklin were hanging out there, and you know, like people who were holding questions of how do we live now? What does society need to look like? What does religion need to look like? And I guess in that wave of sort of liberalism and inquiry and scientific thinking was part of that as well. So Joseph Priestley is normally best known for discovering oxygen, but that was kind of just his hobby outside of his main job of being a minister. But that intertwining of intellectual inquiry was really part of what these Unitarian forebears were exploring. And kind of for better and worse, right? It was kind of part of um, the Industrial Revolution, and we know what mischief that has caused for us all. But at the time, of course, what an exciting time to be part of thinking, seeing what's possible, how people's lives can be different shaped. Um, and then maybe another milestone is like 1813 when it stopped being illegal to be a Unitarian, and then they kind of like went big, um, and that was maybe a kind of a heyday for Unitarians in a lot of ways, and lots of like city mayors were Unitarian, and lots of thinkers and doers and social reformers in the 19th century were Unitarians. But at the same time, there was a shift from being the sort of outsiders who had to sort of meet in secret to the legitimacy that they kind of lent into. And part of that is the change from having meeting houses that were hidden down alleyways to then being able to build like big Gothic church-shaped churches in city centres. Um, and I kind of feel like something was lost then. I don't know exactly what, but I think moving from the outsider to the centre, um, and maybe adopting some of the habits of the mainstream that they'd initially been against.
Be
I think
respectable,
things
maybe in that some way. We've talked.
right.
It's just as soon as you get to be respectable, there's a change in the culture. It's something we've spoken about, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then the kind of Unitarian history in the 20th century is one of decline. There's not very many Unitarians around now. We've got 150 churches, but half of them have got like fewer than 10 members. And, most of those would be in their 70s and 80s. Um, and and yet when I meet people and talk to them about Unitarianism, where it's like, it's all about freedom and inquiry and finding your own spiritual path, but doing that in community and drawing on wisdom from all sources. And yes, we might include the Bible, but certainly we'd include other sacred texts, but also art and philosophy and nature, and drawing on all of human and the natural world's wisdom. And we've had LGBT ministers since the 1970s. We've had female ministers since 1904. We were among the first to do religious same-sex weddings. It's decentralized. It's not hierarchical. Each church is autonomous. It's owned and run by the community. Decisions are made by the community. When I explain what this DNA is, more often than not, people's faces light up and they're like, hang on, I didn't know church could be like that. And so it feels like we're at this really peculiar stage where, and this is really why I'm doing this job, I think, is because there is this incredible infrastructure and heritage and ethos, theology practice that feels incredibly ripe and ready for these times. But most people have never heard of it. And it's really at a critical point of risk because, when you've got half a dozen quite elderly people stewarding a congregation, like it doesn't take much for people to say, you know what, we're done, we can't carry on. And then it's not just the loss of the building, because that is just bricks and mortar, even if it's very thoughtfully founded bricks and mortar. But it's also the kind of the heritage and that um, the what that bricks and mortar represents. You know, once it's sold off to property developers, it's not going to come back to be in service of love and community. You know, so I'm really conscious of how we are at this critical point. That's true of nearly all denominations as well. But you know, when we are very small to start with, and it feels like there's something incredibly vital in our DNA, then um, yeah, we're really at this point of transformation, hopefully.
So maybe I interject, well, come back with the question. So what has been the most rewarding part of working to shift the institution? And then maybe if we could go, even from a personal standpoint, the biggest challenges, I suppose. I think a lot of people have probably on the call have thought about, well, God, there's these existing institutions. Instead of starting from something from scratch, we should kind of try to change them. So they really, yeah, really have been working on that for some time. It would be, I think, fascinating for people to hear more about those
Right.
aspects.
Um, well, both are hard, right? Starting new things is hard, and changing old things is hard, and they're hard in different ways, and some are the same ways. Um, so yeah, I mean, when I was working at Sunday Assembly, um, which was a global network of secular congregations that was started by two stand-up comedians, and I was
Mm.
sort of brought in when they'd been going for a couple of years to sort of try and make it work. Um, and but that was with no money. Like so many months when it was like, oh, we don't know how we're going to pay people's salaries next month. No training schemes, or at least nothing sort of very robust. The lightest of frameworks, no deep theology, but a huge amount of energy and passion. And um, and so there were things that were hard about that, but there were things that were very free as well because it was brand new. Whereas when you're leading something that's been around for a few centuries, like there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions about what is right and what is wrong in the way to do it. And when you've got useful things like governance structures, when you are a registered charity, when you have trustees, when you have lots of processes for lots of things that are necessary for the good, healthy running of this kind of um, charity organization, like it's like just practically hard to change things. And so there's something I think there's something really important um, about the role of these old institutions, though, because I find it really easy to be grumpy about institutions and, like they're not fit for purpose. They were built in a different age, burn them all down, start from scratch. Um, but there's something really important about the process of change, because it's easy to kind of say, this old institution is awful and it's part of the problem, whatever. We could talk about our political system or our educational system or all of the structures that we live among. It's hard to say that any of them are really the right shape for today. But there needs to be some kind of transition. I don't think we know well what that looks like. We can look at other parts of the world where there's been sort of revolutions, or there's been um, it's sort of intense change, but it's often violent in lots of different ways, lots of different kinds of violence. And then there can be sort of slow incremental change, and it sort of feels like, well, we don't have time for that.
Mm-mm.
Whether it's in the Unitarian Church where half our congregations are, just being kept afloat by a handful of elderly people, or whether it's in, our political structures or, other structures where it's like, well, we don't have time because of the state of the world. And so this broader question of like, well, so what do we do? How do we enable this transformation in our societal structures? Where we're not burning it all down and starting from scratch, because we know there's limitations of that, but we're not expecting that incremental slow change is what's needed. And so I spent a lot of time, thinking and inquiring about, so what does transformation look like? And I find it most helpful when I remember that these are living systems, these things that are groups of people, and living systems, they're part of the natural world. And so how do things change in the natural world? What are the patterns of transformation that happen? Don't think there's any simple answers there either, but it sort of helps me to sort of not think in the kind of rigid lines.
Mm-mm.
I'm so often envious of people I know who are sort of starting new things and have the kind of total freedom and total creativity. And I also know that they've just got a different set of challenges. Um, and and I think that there is something in the sort of Unitarian framework which has like creativity and evolution baked in. We are very deliberately saying we don't have a set liturgy that we've been doing for 1,000 years and going to do for the same thing for 1,000 more years. We are, our formation is because we said we don't want that. We want to be led by our conscience and adapt to the situation, and kind of follow the spirit of what's needed. But that's hard as well, because it's easy to get stuck in a routine of like, oh, we do this because we always do this. And so I'm interested in like, what are the conditions that allow that creativity, that give people the confidence and the capability to evolve well, and to offer the things that really meet people's spiritual needs today, now, in today's cultural context, religious context. So yeah, it's peculiar to be, you know, in a position of leadership in that context where things are slow and things are fast, and you kind of see the long, slow arcs of, of course this is a long game, but also feeling the urgency, and just sort of feeling the dynamics between those.
What do you think your position, your time with the Unitarians has taught you about the God-shaped whole?
Great question. Well, one of the things that's been an incredible privilege of this job is that I've been able to have conversations with all sorts of people about like what God is, or is not. And when I wrote the essay, when I was sort of in my earlier church going years, I absolutely sort of assumed that when people said God, they meant like this old man in the sky who was in charge of things. And the more I've spent time with all sorts of different religious folk, it's like, oh, no one means that. I'm sure some people do. Not many people do. Um, and so there's something really peculiar in secular Britain today where, so many people would say like, oh no, not God, not for me. But what they're rejecting is that idea of the booming voiced old man in the sky. And so there's a hole, the God shaped hole is because of that rejection. And one thing that I think that Unitarians and maybe others haven't expressed well is that there's so many more options of how to think about the thing that some people call God. And it's like it's famously difficult to describe what God is, right? As well, this is the thing that people can agree on, is that it's there's no good language for it. What's being described is hard to put into words. Um, so I think there's something important about what is that whole? Why does that whole exist? Need that whole exist if we have better conversations about what God might be. Um, and it's also so clear that there is a deep spiritual hunger in so many people. They might not use that language for it, but I think this is just a sort of a fundamental part of being human, is that we don't just exist in a sort of materialistic way. We are emotional beings, and human cultures have developed to find ways to help us live well together. And those ways have generally been called religion. But religion is just a kind of culture. And it's a pro-social cultural techniques to help us live well together. And like in Britain, we just stopped doing that, and our mainstream culture is telling us that we'll be happy if we buy more things. And there isn't an idea more poisonous than that. It's and so maybe I started off in my own journey with this, of feeling it as a very personal thing, of me feeling like, oh, I think there's something missing, but it's obviously not religion, but I wish it was. But it's also cultural, it's societal. There's a societal God-shaped hole that kind of by default, the thing that slipped into that place is like power and money. And obviously it's killing us in so many ways. And so I think part of the reason for that God-shaped hole is that we have let the stories prevail about what God is, what religion is, that are sort of really unhelpfully from a time that's not relevant anymore. The structures and ideas of religion that were presumably useful once, but then stopped being useful, and so there weren't the people taking part to keep it evolving. Mm. And so now there's this sort of quite vestigial thing that needs to be reanimated, but most of us haven't had much practice in church making. And so we're kind of from a bit of a standing start. But I think it doesn't take much to re-equate people with the confidence and skills to create their own rituals, to care about ceremony, to care about community, to recognize their hunger for it. And yeah, so on a hopeful day, I feel like um, there's something really ready to ignite because
Right.
the hunger is so deep, because there's been such a long time where people haven't had the community and connection and depth of care and culture that religion has always offered to people.
So can we talk about prayer a little bit in that context? One thing we spoke about before the call was this. So I get this response all the time when you start talking about rituals or culture or all sorts of things. Well, guy, I don't want to do that. I don't want to kind of make something because there's this kind of it's been decided beforehand that it's going to be forced or that somehow we're going to have a paint by numbers or some type of wooden approach if we create our own rituals or if somebody reinterprets the Bible, then there's going to be an order to it. And I wonder, do you think there's something about the lack of practice, like just prayer, for example? Okay, when you sit down and pray, one kind of like gives up talking to your own ego and talks to something larger than yourself, right? You stop, you say, like, okay, I don't have to answer this. Oh Lord, I'm going to talk to you instead. And kind of, I think a lot of us would have the sensation of the the person that fills up the mind all the time falling away a little bit. We have a different kind of conversation, and that conversation is the kind where rituals, ideas about rituals seem to just come out of nowhere, or art, or uh, all the rest of it. And is it the alienation from that space part of what we're talking about here, that people haven't prayed? We've kind of lost our ancestors' connection to that space, and if so, how do you deal with that personally? What insights has your work given you?
So I think science has been really unhelpful in this because we're kind of brought up to think very literally around about the world. And so the idea of talking to God in your mind is like, well, what's that going to do? Um, and I remember actually in my earlier career in scientific journals, like where there'd be like a randomized control trial to sort of see if the patient recovers better if people are praying for them. I remember just sort of laughing at that, of thinking like, what a ridiculous thing to think. But what you're talking about with prayer is, I think, the practice of like orienting oneself differently, of, yeah, like you said, kind of being in a position where the ego gets out of the way. Um, I Because I've never been able to get on board with the idea of a personified God, I can't personally get my head around the idea of praying to a person. Doesn't, just doesn't compute. Um, but I have found it useful to um, kind of feel into my place in the interconnectedness of all life, which I think is doing the same thing. Um, and and I think there's also probably lots of things that people do all the time that are praying, even if they wouldn't necessarily think of it that way. Of the kind of, the state of being that you might be in when you're kind of watching a sunset or something like that, or, where you're kind of standing on top of a hill or something, and you're kind of um, sort of happily unbothered about the sort of material directionality of things.
Mm-mm-mm.
Um,
Maybe in contact with the thing that is being personified, or whatever we can call it, not a thing, but whatever is being personified when we have a conversation with somebody called God.
Right, right. And I kind of think it doesn't matter like what you're aiming it at, as long as it works for you. Um, and and I know that I can sort of glibly say that, but people not very long ago or not very far away would just not be allowed to say that. Um, and and so that kind of relates to culture, right? You know, where religion and kind of a sense of tribalism have been kind of one and the same thing for so long in so many parts of the world. Um, you know, your religion is your tribe, and so you do things this way. You pray to this God. You pray in this way. You know, and so that's not really how Britain today is. You know, there it's very hard to have that kind of very unified sense of identity, which is great in lots of ways. Um, but it also makes it harder to learn how to pray, um, because there are so many different ways of doing it. Um, and there aren't very many spaces to learn it in. You know, you're most likely to learn it in a place that tells you, no, this is the correct way to do it. Like, this is who you're praying to, this is how you're praying, or meditating, or whatever it might be. Um, and so, yeah, I think there is something really important in um, equipping ourselves with the principles of how these things work, how prayer works, like what's happening, and therefore how can we do it well, for now in our own context, in our own culture. Not to say this is the only way of doing it and everyone's got to do this. I found the best way, but to recognize it as being a contextual thing. And so what's good praying for me might not be good praying for you. Um, but how, you know, but that doesn't mean that we can't sort of compare notes and help each other. Um,
Mm-hmm. So another question is, so I'm sure you've heard these stats lately that church attendance has suddenly rocketed up, especially among young people in the last few years. Um, I'm wondering if you could just talk to that, your thoughts on it, why now we probably might, but really your response to that in your position, what you make of it, and what you've heard about a response as well, because you obviously would, I think, be very well connected to lots of people who are trying to reawaken this comfort with something larger, with whatever it is we call God, or with the mystical, or mystery, maybe is a more comfortable term for some people.
right. So I think on the kind of um, the news that more young people are going to church, I think it depends on like who paid for the research, as with so many things. But I think at least anecdotally, there is a big change. And certainly in the, decade or so, if I think about when I started going to Unitarian Church and was too ashamed to tell anyone, that I don't feel like that would be the case now. I think there is a much more kind of openness. I think COVID sped that up a lot. It suddenly became, much more acceptable to sort of talk about your mental health, because we were all kind of, you know, sad and bonkers for quite a long time. And so it became much more normal to kind of check in with people about that. And then I think it's not so far to um, to then be talking about your spiritual health. And I think that there's also maybe a post-COVID thing of people like just yearning for in-person things, um, and different ways of connecting, um, and also like the state of the world, right? I've had friends who are never chosen to go into a church in their lives, who sort of quietly got in touch to say, like, I'm a bit scared about the future and the state of the world, and I think that there might be something to do with spirituality that's relevant, but I don't really know what or where to start. But yeah, the kind of deep precarity and uncertainty, and you know, we are living among, we're living among the knowledge that the systems don't work. Um, it's you know it whenever you open Instagram, right? It's like this is not a world that makes sense, or that is governing itself well. And so yeah, so that of course that is felt in people. I think there's a generational thing as well in that um, people older than me quite often were sort of brought up in a sort of sense of like stiff upper lip, don't talk about your feelings, especially in a kind of very British kind of buttoned up kind of way. And people younger than me, are very happily kind of comparing notes on therapists and, things like that. It's much more normal to be kind of open about your emotional life. Um, and so that plays out as well when people can express that they've got a need that relates to their inner world. Um, Whereas I think one of the things that I, found like a huge relief when I started going to church was like, oh, people are acknowledging that they've got an inner world. Like I'd never really experienced that before. Um, and so to have a space where you can do that, like, it sort of feels essential. Um, and again, it doesn't need to be a church. This is like, do we live in a culture where people can connect around the things that are most important to them and the things that are going on inside them and their hopes and their fears and their their the things that they are excited about and the things that they feel shameful about.
Mm-hmm.
um it's not easy to talk about those things just in the pub or whatever, um but we need to be talking about them. And it feels really important that we don't just get to talk about them if we pay someone like a therapist to listen to us. It feels like, well, that's a failure of culture. Um, it's it's a very necessary thing because we don't have these sort of more organic cultural spaces where we are tending to each other's inner lives proficiently. Um, but yeah, so it feels entirely unsurprising that more people um, would be looking for something.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you see that side of people more because of your position? There's kind of a permission to talk about that
Oh
around
yeah,
you.
yeah, and this is something that I think is sort of like an acknowledged thing. Um, so like our Unitarian minister in Leicester, he's also a gym instructor, and he still teaches some gym classes. And when people have sort of discovered, oh, did you know that the gym instructor is a minister? After the classes, they want to talk to him about like their what's on their heart, because they kind of know there's permission. Now, of course, in all of the other gym classes, they've still got those things going on, but once they kind of acknowledge that. And so, yeah, I think for me as well, um, I think that was an important part of my experience of like finding in a church community, oh, it's okay to, you know, uh, talk about your inner life and share that with other people and be in community around what's really going on for us. And then kind of realizing, oh, it's not just this particular bunch of people, this is all humans. They're just not doing it elsewhere. And so I think, yeah, once you've kind of got that, you've kind of put those glasses on, then yeah, you see it everywhere. And I think people kind of feel it in you as well and kind of want to tell you their life story.
So
um
how much of the God-shaped hole is the fact that almost nothing is real if it's not shared, then, you know,
Huh, that's interesting. Right, because I think one of the sort of deep ironies of being human is that everyone feels like they're a bit like different and on the edge and on the outside and not quite belonging. That's the thing that we've all got in common, I think. Um, and so you can see how it's easily like a downward spiral. If you don't have places of connection and community to be reminded of your common humanity, to be reminded that you do belong in this funny family of apes, that you're not just on your own and um, uniquely failing at life. It's like no, we're all just messy and muddling through. Um, and yeah, and of course, with the breakdown of so many other forms of community, um, people don't get those, even the secular spaces, to have that sense, even if it's not explicitly spoken. If you also don't have that felt sense of like, oh, we're all building the same ship, or we're all in the working in the same coal mine, or whatever the things were that gave people a sense of belonging and community not that long ago, or even like working the same land, experiencing the same seasons, the same weather, and working together to do that. Like we don't have very many spaces to feel that, and you're not really going to feel it in most sort of work environments either,
mm-mm.
um, because you're there because you're being paid. It's a whole different thing going on. Um, so yeah, I think those opportunities, and that's something that can come through other spaces as well. So like arts, where people are having that communal experience of watching a play or watching a concert or something, and they're like, oh, we are all feeling the same thing because of what we're experiencing.
Right.
It feels very different to like you know watching a film on TV on your own at home.
Well,
It's like you laugh louder when you're at a comedy club than when you're watching telly on your own.
yeah, yeah. I mean, emotions are all social.
Right.
Speaking of which, I feel like maybe this is a good time to open it out to the floor for questions, in the interest of being more social. Is there anything more you want to say before we do that, Liz? Or
Oh no, let's see what people would like to talk about.
exactly. So the floor is open for questions. I think we've gotten through most of what we talked about before. Yeah. Oh, so
Thanks a lot for that, Liz. Appreciate it. Really interesting stuff. I just had a question. What does a typical Unitarian meeting look like? What's the format? Thank you.
Well, they'll all be different, but you will typically have hymns, and they'll be sort of hymn shaped, but won't um, won't be didactic, or won't they'll be full of questions more than answers. There'll be readings from different texts. There'll be poetry. There'll be meditation, or times for quiet. I think something that's really powerful is when people participate as well. When quite often, so something that a lot of Unitarian churches do is they have a time for candles of joy and sorrow, where people can kind of go and light a candle and say, this is something that's going on in my life right now, and just be witnessed by the rest of the community. Um, but the but it really is really open, um, and yeah, every congregation's different. Every flavor's it's different flavor in every place, and will keep changing.
okay, maybe yeah. The Zoom is Mark Nuala and Joe. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes. Um, my name's Brian, by the way. Hello, Liz. Um, you mentioned early on that people were inventing their own rituals and their own stories in lieu of the religious ones that they would have probably inherited a couple of centuries ago or a century ago. Um, I wondered if you had any examples of how people are satisfying their hunger for this kind of thing that look like secular activities, but that you could actually reclassify as religious activities. Can you think of anything like that? To give you one example, I won't talk for long, but I've actually never been to a psychotherapist, but it just occurred to me when you were talking that maybe that is a way that people are finding a sense of looking into a way of looking into themselves. It's like having your own priest, actually, isn't it? Possibly. I wonder.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. So I think that is what is happening, is that there's lots of individual secular things like therapy, like meditation apps, where it's been all of the different, or like, I don't know, football matches or, things like that, where all of the different elements are, people are finding them and expressing them in different ways. And in one sense, like, some people would say, yeah, that's great. That's how things have changed. And people go to yoga classes instead of going to church. And that's great. That's progress. But I feel really strongly that there's something much more powerful when it's all in the same place, when you're getting all of those needs met in the same community, in the same place. And I think that there's sort of endless scope for what the secular looking alternatives might be, because I think that all human expression and creativity um, can be embraced in this work. So I don't know, I just was thinking about a loaf of bread. You can bake a loaf of bread and cut a slice and put it in the toaster, and like it's a totally meaningless experience. Or you can sort of hold the loaf of bread together with your loved ones and sort of call to mind something important, and collectively look towards the values that are most important to you and share the bread together. It's kind of the same thing that's happening, but it's the meaning that um, you're putting on it. And so I think all of this stuff can be done without any mention of religion or God, and without it needing to be in a church building, or having, people with, particularly special training. Not to say that that's not valuable, but I really think that there's something really important about the democratization of ritual, to remember that this is something that belonged to all humans, before people had thought about organizations and things like that. It's like it's so much more fundamental.
Yeah.
So I think there's great creative scope to play.
Thank you.
Great. So we've got Oscar is next.
Hi, Oscar.
Hey, Liz. So I think I remember from some earlier conversations that we've had that pilgrimage is an important word and practice to you. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how pilgrimage as a concept and practice relates to what you're talking about in this article and today.
Yeah, thank you. And I should say that Oscar is a Unitarian minister.
Hi, everyone.
So there is an expert in the room. So some work that I did after leaving Sunday Assembly and before starting this work was with a brilliant woman called Vanessa Zoltan, who who's a Jewish atheist, and she found herself at divinity school and recognized, like, well, if I'm an atheist, I don't think that this book is any more sacred than that book. And can I pray with Jane Eyre? And she did, and it worked. And she realized that she wanted to not just read the book, in sort of reading group style, but to do that kind of in situ and with pilgrimage built in. So we worked together to develop a pilgrimage around Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and we would read the book every day, but using the kind of techniques that monks had used to read the Bible, that can kind of help you tap into any underlying meaning, not in a kind of literary criticism way, but in a kind of, what is this telling you about your life, and what is it telling you about the universe? But we walked every day, started off in London and Bloomsbury, where Virginia Woolf lived, and then to the South Downs, where she lived and where she died. And with this group of pilgrims who had like varying levels of experience of Virginia Woolf as well, we found that the physical practice of walking is useful, in, again, sort of getting the ego out the way, and also doing that in a beautiful place, and in a place where it's easy to connect with a wider oneness, and where you're outside of your normal situation. We did several other pilgrimages as well, together. We did Jane Eyre, we did Pride and Prejudice, we did Little Women in Massachusetts. They've since gone on to do like a Taylor Swift pilgrimage, and just trying out, how does this work with different beloved things. And one of the things that we found to be important was, when you're outside of your normal life patterns, you have to rely on other people more. And we don't often have to do that. We're quite, in the West, quite self-contained, quite self-reliant, and quite used to sort of, paying people if we want something done. But obviously, traditionally, pilgrims would be rocking up in a new town without anything, and just relying on someone to recognize the practice that they were in and say, oh, of course, I'm going to help you. Of course, I'm going to give you a bed for the night. I'm going to, give you dinner or whatever. So I think that, yeah, I guess there's, there is this practice of pilgrimage, which used to be just a very practical thing of like, how else are you going to get to the sacred site than by walking? But as ever, kind of getting to the destination isn't really the point. So I think that there's lots that we can reimagine now.
Thank you.
Okay, over to Cesar.
Thank you, Liam. My question sort of touches on things that I've noticed are arising to me, which is sort of the points of departure. I think the points of departure where we address this relation to the mystery, or God, goddesses, however we want to describe it, and how we relate to it. To me, it defines the way that we relate to it. So you just mentioning sort of the book that was chosen in a very British context, right? So that's a point of departure, right? And I'm curious to know whether you have experienced other points of departure that are outside of, for example, the British context, outside of the European context, or Eurocentric context, in a way that, for example, if we're talking about the Catholic point of origin, in sort of like the neglection of that, sort of like perhaps other points of departure in relationship to that, and how this, for example, can express in how the space is defined as a church or as a temple, right? Or this is sort of where I want to go to.
Right. And yeah, I am entirely British in my perspective, like painfully so. And with that also from a Protestant background, it's like my cultural heritage is really narrow. And so I won't try to talk to I won't pretend that I'm speaking for all cultures and all contexts by any means. And I think that's really important. I guess again, from a British perspective, like Britain is very multicultural, and it's really important for us to work out what does that mean for our collective spiritual health. There's many reasons why it's an abomination that the Church of England is still the established church. But one is that like this is not representative of the people of Britain. And so, why would we say that the kind of most senior spiritual leader position currently vacant of the Archbishop of Canterbury, when that's such a narrow expression of what spiritual, if that's the person who is officially in some ways responsible for the spiritual health of the country, but they're only able to speak to a very particular way of doing faith, of course that's a broken system. And I don't think that collectively we have really worked out, well, what do we do about that? Like, how do we talk about this well, and also recognizing that so many people are in families of mixed heritage, which really wasn't that common. Like, not, you don't have to go very far back for that to be, for it to be shocking that a Protestant person would marry a Catholic person. Like that's we're not very far beyond that being a really unusual thing. Whereas now, of course, like it's such a rich mix, and yeah, I don't think there's been anything like enough meaningful exploration of well, how do we do this well then? So yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Great. So on to Jenny. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Jen. Hi, Liam. Thank you for that. And just to say, I've really enjoyed the conversation this evening. Thank you, Liz, for it's expanding my mind a lot. I don't know if this is a naive question, really, but are all Unitarians atheist or not? And how do you relate to the term atheist and agnostic in your space? It's hurting my head trying to think of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So no, there's a huge range of I guess theological perspectives and identities. Probably the most typical identity, I suppose, would be agnostic-ish, but there's probably not good language for it, because I think there is something like a sense of like being spiritually open and kind of journeying, like not necessarily settled on like this is my perspective and that's what it will always be, but a kind of a commitment to openness and fluidity, I think. Yeah, when I first went to Unitarian Church, it felt really important to me to sort of say that I was an atheist and that I was reassured that the minister was an atheist, because otherwise it would have felt too far a leap. It would have felt dishonest, I think, maybe even to because I would have felt like I had to pretend. I haven't really described myself as an atheist for a long time. I wouldn't describe myself as a theist either. I'd probably just avoid answering the question. or rather kind of say, well, it's complicated. And I think part of what is tricky as well is that it's kind of unhelpfully centered, that question of like, do you believe in God or not? Because I kind of want to say, well, what do you mean by believe and what do you mean by God? And then suddenly it's a difficult conversation. But I think that is the kind of unpacking that's needed. And when we're at that sort of kind of slightly superficial level of labels, like they're never going to do justice. I see that they were useful when you're kind of trying to say, you in this tribe or you out. But again, kind of related to the sort of multicultural world that we are in, like that's not helpful. It needs to be more nuanced and kind of similar, I suppose, to a kind of like, which party do you vote for? Like, I think for so many people now, the answer again is it's complicated. And so I think these traditional sort of tribal labels that have been so built into our culture kind of don't, they don't work anymore. So I think we do need to be diving into those richer conversations. And I think that is something that Unitarians have quietly been doing very well for a long time. Of kind of just taking as read, yeah, of course it's complicated. Come on in and have a cup of tea. We'll talk about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great answer. And over to Simon.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Can I kind of cheat by asking two questions, but to me they're very closely related. One is, so I happen to have had the wonderful experience of going to a Unitarian service in Washington, D.C. in America. And there were hundreds of people there. It definitely wasn't just 5 OAPs keeping it going. It had tremendous energy and beauty and poetry and everything and real, electricity in the service. And I found that fascinating. So one of my questions is going to be, what do you think is the difference between here and there as to why things like that are happening there and not in the UK? It struck me that one thing behind that might be that that New England Protestantism, which was such a big thing in America, say from the 17th century onwards, sort of somehow evolved into Unitarianism over there for them. So it's almost like deeply rooted in a more established religion than it is in Britain. But that perhaps wouldn't explain it for Washington, D.C., which was never part of New England, and that whole sort of Puritan scene was just not there. So it's still mysterious. But so swinging into the second question is like, how is it for you and the Unitarians when it comes to ecumenism? Because do you do things with other churches as well, and where you find people in other churches who have similar feelings and views? Because part of what you're saying seemed to be that actually lots of people in different churches and religions are kind of moving in the direction, almost moving into the Unitarian space, changing their ideas of God. And does that mean that there's more you can do together? Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. And I feel like Oscar would have some useful things to say as well. But I think with the US, yes, as you say, kind of half the founding fathers were Unitarian, so it's kind of like quite baked in. But I think that more important than that is just that America is a vastly more religious country than Britain is, and I've met quite a few American Unitarians who have kind of said, well, I didn't really have a religion, but it felt like I had to have one. And so, the Unitarian Universalists were the kind of place that I went. And also I've heard folks in the US kind of say, particularly if they are living in areas that aren't very socially liberal, then it can be a kind of a place to meet like-minded people from that sense. But I do think the main thing is like the tide is just much higher of like religious participation, and Remind me, your second question was about the.
Sorry, was like, I mean,
Oh,
is it,
with other churches.
with other churches, and I just wonder if somehow it's almost like the space is being taken now by lots of people in other churches who are saying, well, I'm a Catholic, but that's not really what you thought it meant, or
Yeah,
something like that.
right. And I think so. Some people have kind of said that, the reason for Unitarian decline is because, like, well, you guys won. Like, you were fighting for religious tolerance. We've got that. You were fighting for religious freedom. Like, we've got that. You're fighting for sort of rational thinking. It's like, well, that's the mainstream culture now. Like, why would you go to a place that's specifically for those things? And so I think that's a really important thing of like how the positioning of the Unitarian ethos has changed, or that like the mainstream culture has changed in relation to the Unitarian ethos, but we haven't necessarily adapted to kind of change the way we're expressing. So back in the day, it was like deeply radical to say, no, we're holding on to science while we're doing religion. We're holding on to rational thought while we're embracing the mystic. But then as those values, those sort of rational values became sort of mainstream, and ideas of tolerance became mainstream, then it's like, well, why are you holding on to those things so tightly? Like, not being the Church of England doesn't matter to most people. Having the not having the Trinity like doesn't affect most people's lives. But what I do see is that there's an important role of being counter to the secular individualistic consumer world in a way that is accessible to a lot of people who aren't going to necessarily join another church. But there's still there's a lot of church clubs that won't let us in. There's so like Churches Together, which is like the main sort of church, multi-church group in the UK. Unitarians can't be part of, because part of the membership criteria is like you've got to sign up to this creed of saying that like Jesus is God, and it's like, well, we don't think that, so we can't come in. So yeah, there's a lot going on, but I don't know whether, Oscar, there is anything that you'd want to say about the differences you've seen, your experience between the US and UK.
Well, I think you captured it. I think the one thing that I would add from my perspective is just that it is true that church attendance is much higher in the US. It is also true that our demographics vis-a-vis church attendance look a lot like the UK about two, maybe three generations ago, and going the same direction. So there is a lot that in seeing the context in the UK allows me to wonder about, okay, how will we navigate this transition? Because it's coming here too. The statistic that I often use here is that between 2000 and 2019, our numbers for children enrolled in religious education in Unitarian churches dropped by a third. And then they dropped by another third between 2019 and 2023 in the pandemic. So they went down by half in a generation. So yes, the US is more religious in general, but also it's not a different set of questions.
Thanks, Oscar.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're officially out of time. We're also out of questions that rounded out very well. So first of all, I'd like to thank Liz for coming, and for everybody else for joining us for a really deep, stimulating, as always, discussion. Liz, it was a real pleasure. We didn't even get into your environmentalism, which I feel ashamed, seeing as I direct a climate organization, but another time. But I don't know if you have time to stick around for any more discussion afterwards, Liz, or you have places to be. But sometimes we let people, kind of mingle if there's time and interest. So that would be.
I can stay a little bit, but I do need to go shortly. But yeah, if there's any other sort of burning questions, then I do think that there is space. But also people should feel free to go and not stay out of politeness. But I wanted to just sort of address what you said about like, oh no, we haven't talked about the climate. She's like, no, this is all about that. Because the way I see it is like, you know, why have we been fucking it all up? It's because people have been trying to get happy by having power and money. It's that's whether it's like um you know partly the kind of it doesn't solve anything if you have a bigger yacht thing, but there's always a bigger yacht to have, but also that sense of separation that our culture kind of has, in effect designed in order to build empire or build industry, you have to dehumanize people or you have to desacralize the natural world. If you're going to have an extractivist attitude, like you can't do that if you feel that it's sacred. And so yeah, I think all of this we've been talking about is kind of really the roots of the problems we find ourselves among, and also the path through, of because some people say to me like, oh, like, maybe you can really spread the message through the church organizations that we need to do more for the climate, blah, 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 write to your MP, get solar panels, whatever. But it's like, no, it's this practice. It's this practice of being in community and being connected to things that are deeper and more expansive